Good evening. Hopefully, all have had a good afternoon and tickled to be back together this evening. I stayed reasonably cool down here this morning, so I'll try to do the same here this evening as well. Over the course of our Sunday nights, off and on for the last couple months, we've been talking about apostles. And tonight is our fifth lesson, although I think the seventh apostle, maybe, because we've combined a couple of them. But tonight we're going to be talking about the apostle Thomas. I want to pose a question for you to start with, probably the route that most would have expected us to be going. And I'll ask you, why is it that we sometimes doubt? Why is it that we sometimes doubt? Well, for a couple of answers that popped ahead for me and maybe for you as well, is sometimes we have new knowledge, right? Sometimes we have new information that maybe leads us to doubt something that we thought we might have known. Maybe it's through things like stress, through exhaustion, through failure, right? You know, if you're working on something for a class or a project for work and you can't seem to quite get it right, maybe you're doubting, maybe I'm not the person for this task, or maybe I'm not capable of doing this. Sometimes it's through things like pain and suffering, right, that cause us to doubt. And all of us can relate to that with illnesses or through loss of loved ones or whatever it might would be. And if we're being real honest, I would imagine that most of us doubt quite often, right? It's fairly easy to fall into doubt. A couple of years ago, you may remember this, but I gave a sermon about how doubt is actually good, how doubt is a challenge for us, that when we doubt, it presents a challenge for us. It makes us question ourselves, but hopefully, ultimately, makes us strengthen ourselves as well. If everything goes perfectly in life at all times, it's not very realistic, right? You know, if everything is always going perfectly, then we have no reason, I guess, to doubt, but we also aren't living in a real world. And so doubt can give us a chance to strengthen ourselves as well. So if I were to ask you, who is the most famous doubter in history? Ta-da! All right. I already knew that it was there, but I guess I could have kept it for just a minute. But not only is Thomas considered the most famous doubter, right? His name, and we'll get to that in a second, but there's a front part of it as well that now is doubting Thomas. And if you go to work tomorrow and you say, there is no way that we can do this, there's a chance that somebody might look at you and say, well, you're a doubting Thomas. And you would know what that means. In fact, people who maybe have not been to church in 20 years might know what that means as well. This comes from something that we see in John chapter 20 and verse 25. You may remember that Thomas in this story, and we're going to get to it here as we go forward, but Thomas said he wanted to do a couple things. He said he wanted to see the nail marks in Jesus' hands, and he also wanted to put his finger there as well, right? He said, then if I could put my hand in his side, right? Well, if you've read in the Gospels, those are the things that happened to Jesus, right? He was hung on the cross with nails and he was pierced in the side. And so Thomas is saying, well, I need to be able to touch those spots. Hold up that hand with the big circle in it. Let me stick my finger all the way through it. Then I will believe. You may remember in the story that Jesus shows up and lets him do that, right? We'll talk about that more in a minute. But tonight is the seventh of our apostles that we've been discussing, and we'll continue with this again tonight. We'll start, though, the way we've talked about all of these, and I'll ask you, maybe, what's that name again? Anybody ever said that before? Somebody told you, my name is so-and-so. There is nothing more forgettable than a person's name the minute after they say it, right? How many of you all have ever experienced that? My name is Daniel. And then you spend the whole time thinking, what's his name? What did he say his name was? What did he say his name was? Oh, that guy. Yeah. So Thomas is an interesting case for us right here. But I doubt there's many things in your life that you will doubt. Well, there may be several things in your life that you'll doubt, but you'll never doubt your name, right? One thing is, you know what your name is. Most of us have a first, a middle, and a last name. We may have another last name from marriage or something like that. But this is an interesting case. I would say that it's an interesting case about Thomas because nowhere in the Bible do we actually get a real name of what he is. And you might be saying, now, wait a minute. His name is Thomas, and I know a guy named Thomas, and my grandfather's name was Thomas, and there's a guy up the street. Well, okay. Bear with me for a second. I will thank Ben for this. It's the first time that I can say I'm going to thank Ben for talking ahead of me. But I've heard Ben say this many times. It wasn't today, but I'm going to give Ben all the credit for this. So much as I hate to. We'll give it to him. All right. But Thomas comes from this Aramaic word right here, teama, right? Which would be very close to pronouncing the word Thomas. So what does that mean? Well, if you look it up, that word means twin. I don't know if all of y'all can relate to this, but there's a handful of pretty cool people in the room that can relate to being a twin. Isn't that right, Lucille? Isn't that right, Shorty? Some of y'all, the rest of y'all can't, but we can. We can relate to being a twin. I've been asked many times, what's it like to be a twin? I said, I've never had 4 minutes without one, so I don't know. It's hard to say for sure. But it means twin, all right? This word means twin. And so to help clarify this, a lot of the manuscripts also included called didymus or called the twin. Well, that's awesome. That's great. Except the word didymus is just a Greek word that means twin. All right. So it doesn't necessarily clear anything up for me. And so teoma is only used as a descriptor. Didymus can be used as a descriptor for a twin, but it's also a proper noun. It can be used as a name as well. I'd say you can just call him Thomas, though. The one thing, though, that he actually probably wasn't actually named is the one that we can call it. Now, here's what's interesting about this person's name is that we've talked about with some of the apostles how there's a lot of information about some and how there's not a lot of information about others. They're in different spots, the amounts that we see. We're going to talk more about that as we go forward. I've tried to do this for each of the apostles and pose the question, how did this person died? And I've said that most of our descriptions of death are passed down sort of legends and stories, and I've heard this, and this person said this, and this person wrote this down. We looked at a few of them that there was like 5 different ways that supposedly they had died. Well, Thomas is the one that's fairly consistent. Now, I can't say that this is fact, because I don't know if it's fact, but there's only one description that's given for how he died. Still tradition, but there was an early church calendar that read that on July 3rd, St. Thomas was pierced with a lance in India. Now, that's a long, long time ago, but that description was that he was pierced with a lance. Now, I don't know if that's true. That may be tradition. It is interesting that Thomas asked to put his hand where the piercing was, so that may have been what caused that story to be told. But bottom line, that's the only story that's ever been told about the way Thomas died. No other tradition exists about his death. So whatever happened with Thomas, however he passed away, however he died, there's not a whole lot of talk about it. Now, let's get into what we wanted to talk about a little bit more this evening. I would say that if we were talking about the 12 apostles, and I were to ask you to list, maybe we could do this as a group rather than individual, but who are the most famous of the apostles? Let's use the word famous in just the broad sense of who would you know of most. I doubt that we would get very far down the line before you wrote Thomas's name, right? I would venture to say that Thomas is probably more famous than Andrew, who's the first one listed. Peter, Andrew, James, John, Philip, Bartholomew. Shoot, we don't even know Bartholomew. Speaking of people whose names we didn't know, we talked about that the other day. There's some of them at the end that don't get any mention at all. So Thomas is extremely well known. But interestingly enough, he is by far not a famous Bible character. And I mean that. He's mentioned 8 times only in the New Testament. And 4 of those are in the list or in the roster of apostles. So for somebody who doesn't show up a lot, we know him quite a bit. I would venture to say that's because of the story about him doubting, but that would just be me. We first hear about Thomas in John chapter 11. This is what we read just a few moments ago, that scripture reading. Dad, I appreciate you reading it. But Lazarus has just died, and Jesus is preparing to go visit Lazarus' sister, Mary and Martha. And the apostles weren't wanting to go back to Judea. Why were they not wanting to go back? Well, if you were listening and following along with the reading, they said that recently the people there had tried to stone you. And the apostles, in a sense, or the apostles here in a sense are saying, why do we want to go back to an area where they're probably going to kill us? How many of you feel like that's the valid reason to not go back somewhere, right? Makes sense, right? I don't know if this is the place that I am dying to go back to. But eventually, after some discussion, in verse 16, we see Thomas say what? He said in John chapter 11 and verse 16, let us also go that we may die with him. So Jesus is talking to them. But Jesus had just explained that he was going, and he said, if I go and prepare a place for you, then surely one day I would come again, right? That you would be able to join me there. In verse 5, John chapter 14 and verse 5, Thomas is who responds. Verse 5, he says, Lord, we do not know where you are going, and how can we know the way? It's a valid question, right? If you look at these first few verses that Jesus is saying, it's a little bit challenging. I'm going to prepare a place for you. And even though Thomas and all these apostles have been with Jesus the whole time, it's certainly a difficult thought that he's going away, but he's preparing a place and he's going to come back. It gets a little confusing. And so Thomas asks sort of the pertinent question right there. We don't know where you're going, and how can we know the way? Those are two things that we need to know, right? We need to know where we are going. In life, we decide, we read about it, we say, I want to go to this place on vacation. How many of you, if I said money's not an option, could tell me one place that you would love to go on vacation? We could probably all come up with a name, but how many of you, if I said, here's my key, go there right now, could drive straight there? That might be a little tougher, right? We might need to prepare for it. We might need to figure out what is the way. Thomas poses that question. How do we know where you're going, and how can we know the way? Now, how does Jesus respond to that in verse 6, a verse that I'm sure you're all familiar with? He said, Jesus did, I am, what did he say? I am the way. He said, I am the truth, and I am the life. Those three things. He said, I'm the way. So I'm what's going to take you. Right? The truth is what's going to take you. The life in me is what's going to take you. And he said, though, that no man cometh unto the Father except through me. So the way to the Father, the way to God, would be through Jesus. That was the route that they had to go. Now, that's Thomas learning a challenging lesson right there. Now, anybody could have asked that question. I dare say there were probably apostles sitting there saying, well, I'm glad Thomas asked it, but I was going to ask it as well. But anybody could ask that question. But that question is pertinent today. We have to know that answer today. We have to ask that question sometimes. And sometimes our doubt causes us to have to reconsider that question. Sometimes our doubt says, am I going the right way? John chapter 14, verse 6 tells me the way, the truth, and the life is through Jesus. So at this point, I think it's fair to say that Thomas has clearly proven that he's willing to follow Jesus. He's willing to go into difficult positions. They weren't iffy about going to Judea, but he says, we will go with you. But he's not entirely sure where this is going to lead him. And Thomas, being unsure of where it's going to lead him, is something that seems to have stuck with him for the rest of his time with Jesus. Let's go a little further. In John chapter 19, Jesus was crucified and was buried. Now you can read about that in Matthew and Mark and Luke also, but Jesus is crucified and was buried. If you skip through John chapter 19 and the next chapter, you'll see that there was an empty tomb, right? We talked about apostles being present at the empty tomb and racing to John and Peter racing to the tomb. We see later on, Mary Magdalene sees Jesus and Jesus speaks to her. And so now we have Mary and we have other women that see Jesus after his resurrection. And the apostles are brought together and Jesus speaks to them. So if you look at John 19, you see all of this happening. But there's one thing that has to be mentioned. Thomas was not with them. How many of you can remember a time where you missed a day of school, or you missed a day of work, or you said, and so we want to know the story about it. And then somebody tells you, and you're like, I don't know if I can believe that. That seems far-fetched. John chapter 20, let's look at verses 24 and 25. John chapter 20, verse 24 and 25. Now Thomas, called the twin, one of the 12, was not with them when Jesus came. The other disciples therefore said to him, we have seen the Lord. So we've made it clear here that Thomas wasn't there. Unfortunately, bum luck, too bad. He just happened to not be there. And they said, so this is the phone call from when you missed school that day. They said, we have seen the Lord. Now, if you're Thomas, this would have been the last thing you expected somebody to tell you, right? We have seen the Lord. If you're Thomas, your first thought is probably what? I'm not sure. Last time I saw him, he was dead, right? Last time I saw him, he was dead. And so verse 25, so he said to them, unless I see in his hands the print of the nails, and put my finger into the print of the nails, and put my hand into his side, notice he says, I will not believe. Now, the opposite of belief would be doubt, right? So he says, I will not believe. Unless I get to feel around a little bit, unless I get to poke and prod, I will not believe. Now, this is a man who has been with Jesus the whole time. This is a man who has seen untold number of miracles performed, heard untold incredible teachings, but he still needed proof. Do you think that you would have been like Thomas in this situation? You weren't at the grave. You weren't with Mary. You weren't at the meeting when Jesus comes up. Do you think there might have been doubt in you as well? It's hard to say yes or no. And in hindsight, we can easily look back and say, oh, yeah, I'd have been fine. I'd have known for sure. But it seems like that it's more realistic to think that they might not have known. But Thomas says, I doubt. Unless I see these things that I know happen, which tells me Thomas at least saw Jesus hung on the cross and saw him pierced. He says, unless I see and can touch, that I will not believe. So a little time passes. A little bit of time goes by in this story. Actually, 8 days is what passes, I believe. And if we look at John chapter 20, let's pick up with verse 26. After 8 days, Jesus' disciples were again inside and Thomas with them. So that's a change in the story here now, right? Thomas, who wasn't there the first time, is here this time. Jesus came, the doors being shut, and stood in the midst and said, peace to you. Then he said to Thomas, reach your finger here and look at my hands, and reach your hand here and put it into my side. He said, do not be unbelieving, but be believing, right? Do not be unbelieving, but believing. So now Thomas is presented with the thing that he had asked for just a few moments ago, right? I guess we should say a week and a day ago, the thing that he had said. Thomas had said, until I can see him, I shall not believe. Meaning, I have doubt until I see this take place. I think it's interesting, and maybe it's just the way that it's written, but it seems like part of the whole reason for this was Jesus to come back and clarify things for Thomas, right? At least that's the part of the story that gets told. that he said, reach here, look at my hand, reach here, put it into my side. And he said, do not be unbelieving. So if the opposite of unbelieving would be believing, right? But he needed to poke and prod a little bit. But Jesus seems to say that it's pretty clear that once you do this, your belief's going to be there. Verse 28, Thomas answered and said to him, my Lord and my God. Now, the end of verse 27 says, don't be unbelieving, but be believing. At what point does it appear that Thomas is believing? Right then, right? Right then. Because that's not a reaction that would have been, let me see another bit, right? Sometimes we might say, we might not believe something, and then we see it and we're like, I don't know. I was thinking about this the other day, yesterday actually, when they show replay in sporting events, and you're like, well, I think he crossed the goal line, and then they show it from a different angle, and you're like, I don't know if he did or not. And then they show it again, and the more times you see it, you're like, I don't know what I've seen. That's not what we see with Thomas right here, right? He says, my Lord and my God, right there. Now, verse 29 then. What does Jesus say to him? Because he's not done. Jesus doesn't say, all right, job done. Let's move on to the next one. Verse 29. Jesus said to him, Thomas, because you have seen me, you believe. But here's the thing. Jesus wasn't going to be able to just pop up and be poked and prodded on by everybody going forward, right? He said, blessed are those who have not seen and yet have believed. That's a lesson for us right there. That's a lesson for us. Thomas has this moment of skepticism. I get it. I understand it. I'm not even going to really be critical of him because of it. But it's stuck a nickname with him for all time. And I'd venture to say that the day you go to heaven and you meet Thomas, part of your head might think, I hope that's not the case. I hope that's not the case, but it's going to pop into our head, right? But this has evolved into the term that still exists for anybody who needs to see proof of anything before they believe something. I want us to think about for just a second. Thomas had what I think we would call a cautious approach. He's the direct opposite of Peter, probably, when we talk about apostles, right? But he has this cautious approach to believing in what took place. But I think that is a good example for us to think about the importance of faith. When we think about the importance of faith, faith has to be built. We've talked a lot, and I've talked about it up here before, that faith is challenging. Because faith is not something that we actually can just have, right? We think about tactile and tangible things that we can hold in our hand, but faith is not one of those. Faith is something that we have to hold in our heart because you can't physically hold it right there. And it has to be built. Faith is something that encourages in many ways doubt because it's constantly being challenged. This will always be a table and this will always be a book, and that can't be challenged, but faith can. And so faith is a challenge for us just as it was for Thomas. But what Jesus said is the strengthening for us. And I would dare say that it wouldn't hurt us to read John chapter 20 and verse 29 once every week or two just to be confirmed, right? We have not seen, and yet we believe. That is what we have. The song that says faith is the victory, right? But that's what it requires. That overcomes the world. Thomas needed a visual improvement in his faith. We can't get that. But we can strengthen ourselves from the words that Jesus spoke throughout the scriptures that we looked at today. And I would encourage you that even though we might all be at times a doubting Thomas, to not necessarily think about that as a bad way, but think about that as a way to encourage and strengthen us going forward. Because he had that same issue. Fair to say that we'll have the same. If there's anything, any way we can help you, anything that we can do, as always, we invite you to come while we stand and sing.